The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sound so sharp it cut through the laughter and the clink of wine glasses. And for a moment, everything in the Calloway dining room went still. Then the laughter resumed, as though nothing had happened, as though no one had heard, as though Zuri had not been sitting directly across from the woman who had just made the sound, watching her mother-in-law's hand pull back from the edge of the table after deliberately nudging Zuri's water glass into her lap. She stood up quietly. She excused herself quietly. She walked to the bathroom at the end of the hallway and pressed a white linen towel against the front of her dress and looked at herself in the mirror. 39 years old. A company that had processed more than $4 billion in transactions the previous fiscal year. Her face on the cover of Report on Business magazine 3 months ago, and she was standing in a suburban bathroom in Oakville, Ontario, blotting ice water off a dress that had cost more than her first month's rent in the Parkdale apartment, where no one outside that door had noticed, hoping no one outside that door had noticed. They had noticed. They always noticed. That was the point. Zuri Abenadarko had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, the daughter of a Ghanaian nurse who worked double shifts at Scarborough Health Network, and a father who had driven a city bus for 19 years before his knees gave out. She had worn her older cousin's clothes until she was 14. She had done her homework at the kitchen table because there was no desk. And she had learned early that the world did not hand you anything, that every door you wanted to walk through, you'd have to find the handle yourself. She had found a lot of handles. She had studied computer science at Ryerson. U of T now, technically, but she still called it Ryerson because that was what it was when she was there, when she was working part-time at a bubble tea place on Dundas to cover her textbooks. And then she had done a master's in information systems at Waterloo. And then she had spent 4 years at a fintech startup in Kitchener that had gone nowhere, and then she had spent 2 years doing nothing but staring at a spreadsheet in her apartment and building, from scratch, what would become Sova Systems. Sova Systems, infrastructure software for credit unions and smaller regional banks across Canada and eventually across parts of the Commonwealth. She had not set out to build something worth $4 billion. She had set out to solve a problem she kept running into. The way smaller financial institutions were being eaten alive by outdated back-end systems, held together with what amounted to digital duct tape, vulnerable in ways that made her anxious to think about. She had solved that problem, and then the problem had made her rich. She had met Brendan Calloway at a charity gala in 2018. He was tall and charming in the particular way of men who had grown up being told exceptional, and she had liked that about him. At first, the confidence, the ease. He worked in commercial real estate. His family was old money by Ontario standards. Not old money the way England understood it, but old enough that his grandmother had opinions about which golf club you belonged to and what neighborhood you purchased in. And these opinions were delivered as facts. She had liked Brendan. She had loved Brendan. She had also understood, before she said yes to his proposal in the spring of 2021, that his family was a complication. His mother, Harriet Calloway, had made this clear at their very first dinner, not through anything she said outright, but through a precise choreography of small gestures and omissions. The way she had introduced Zuri to the other guests by her first name only, without any mention of what she did, while her sister-in-law's boyfriend, a dentist from Burlington, had been introduced as Dr. Whitfield. The way Harriet had asked, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, whether Zuri's parents were still in Ghana. The implication being that Ghana was where people like Zuri came from, not Scarborough, not this country. The way she had later, over dessert, mentioned that she found it admirable when people worked their way up. Zuri had smiled. She had thanked her. She had eaten her crème brûlée and helped clear the table afterward, even though no one had asked her to. She had told herself it would get better. It did not get better. The pattern of those first 2 years of marriage was something Zuri later struggled to explain to people who had not lived it, because the individual instances were small enough that each one, described in isolation, sounded like nothing. People would say, "Oh, that's just how older generations are." They would say, "She probably didn't mean anything by it." They would say, "Have you tried just talking to her?" The instances were small. There was the Christmas where Harriet had given every other daughter-in-law a Holt Renfrew gift card and had given Zuri a book about personal finance. There was the family photo shoot the following Easter, where Harriet had arranged everyone on the front steps of the Oakville house, and Zuri had ended up just slightly outside the frame. Not noticeably, not dramatically, just enough that the professional prints featured everyone except the woman who had married the eldest son. There was the spring luncheon. The Callaways held a spring luncheon. This was simply a thing they did, where a server had approached Zuri near the drinks table and asked if she could point him toward the kitchen. She had pointed him toward the kitchen. There was the comment about her hair from Brendan's aunt, delivered as a compliment. "You're so brave to wear it like that." There was Harriet's habit of not directing questions about business or finance towards Zuri, even when Zuri was the only person in the room who would know the answer. There was the way Brendan's youngest brother, a man named Colin, who had the particular energy of someone who had never been told no, called her Z, in a tone that sounded like a joke she wasn't in on. And there was Brendan. Brendan, who had promised her, early on, that he would say something. Brendan, who consistently did not say anything. Who, when she raised it with him later, gently, carefully, choosing her moments, would listen with the look of a man performing the act of listening, and then say things like, "She's just old-fashioned," or "You know how she gets," or, once, quietly devastating, "Maybe you could just not take everything so personally." She had not left. She had told herself she was being practical. She had told herself she was choosing her battles. She had told herself that her marriage was not her in-laws, that Brendan and the Callaways were separate things, even when they were very clearly not. She had also, in the way of people who have survived things by being good at surviving, gotten better at being invisible in the Callaway world. She learned which topics to expression. She learned to arrive with a neutral expression and leave without one that gave anything away. She learned not to bring her laptop to family events, not to take work calls in the room where the family was gathered, not to speak first about what she did for a living. If they did not know the shape of what she had built, she could not be asked to defend it against their indifference. Brendan said she was becoming easier to be around. He said this as though it were a compliment. She was 37 years old when he said it, and she stood in their kitchen in Forest Hill and thought about the girl who had done her homework at the kitchen table in Scarborough, and she felt something shift in her chest. But she had not left, not yet. The Callaway Summer Gathering was held every year at the family house on 16 Mile Creek. It was a long weekend in July, which meant it ran Saturday through Monday. People drove in from Mississauga and Hamilton and Burlington. Harriet's sister came from Ottawa. Colin brought whoever he was dating. Brendan's brother Patrick brought his wife, Jennifer, a woman from Rosedale, who had a practice in family law and who was kind to Zuri in a careful way that suggested she understood more than she said. Zuri had stopped trying to get out of it after the third year. Brendan's disappointment when she tried wasn't worth what she'd gained from staying home, so she came. She helped with the salads. She admired things that were admirable and kept her expression pleasant about things that were not. That Saturday, she was sitting on the back deck. The sun had dropped behind the tree line, and it was golden and warm the way southern Ontario evenings get in July. That particular quality of light that makes even a difficult afternoon feel briefly forgivable. She was talking to Patrick, who was asking her, genuinely, about a piece she'd read in the Globe about AI risk in financial systems. Whether she thought the headline had been too alarmist, she was in the middle of explaining her actual view when Harriet appeared at the sliding door. "Zuri, we need someone to go pick up more ice. The store's just down Bronte Road." Patrick said, "I can go, actually," Harriet said. And her voice had that particular light coating, the one that made everything sound like a perfectly reasonable request. I'd love for you to stay and help your father set up the long table. Zuri doesn't mind, do you, dear? Patrick looked at his drink. Zuri looked at Harriet. She drove to the store. She bought the ice. On the way back, she sat in the parking lot of a metro for 7 minutes with the engine running and the radio off. That evening, after dinner, after the dishes, after 2 hours of sitting at a table where 3 different conversations had moved around her, as though she were a decorative object, Brendan's uncle Raymond, who was on his 4th or 5th glass of Riesling, said something. He said it to the table generally, in the way of a man making an observation he found amusing. He said that his wife had been watching a show about black entrepreneurs, and that it made him think that sometimes, these programs and profiles, he gestured vaguely, tended to overrepresent certain demographics, didn't they? Not that that was anyone's fault. He laughed a little. It was just something he'd noticed. Nobody said anything. Colin laughed, briefly, then stopped. Jennifer looked at her plate. Brendan looked at a point in the air somewhere between Raymond and the lake. And Zuri, sitting at the far end of the table, felt something she had been managing for 3 years. That long, careful practice of distance, of watching herself from outside, of being sensible and strategic and above it, simply give way. She put down her fork. She looked directly at Raymond. She said, "I'm sorry. Can you explain what you mean by overrepresent?" Raymond blinked. He made a small sound. He said, "Well, I only meant because either someone built something or they didn't," Zuri said. "Either the company exists or it doesn't. Either the revenue is real or it isn't. I'm not sure what demographic distribution has to do with any of that." Her voice was very steady. That was the thing she noticed about it. How steady it was. She had expected it to shake. Harriet said, "Zuri," in a tone that meant, "Not at the table." Brendan said, let's not do this right now." He said it to Zuri. She looked at her husband. She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking back at her with an expression that she recognized. It was the expression of a man asking her to stand down, to absorb this, to let it go so that the evening could continue undisturbed. And she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had been looking at that expression for 3 years and had, every single time, done exactly what it asked. She stood up. She said, "Excuse me," and she walked into the house. She was in the kitchen. She had her phone in her hand, and she was composing a message to her assistant, Preethi, about a Monday morning call she needed to reschedule, because she had decided she was leaving in the morning, and she needed her Monday clear. Brendan came in after her. He closed the door between the kitchen and the living room. He said, "What was that?" She said. "I asked him to explain what he meant." "You embarrassed him." "He embarrassed himself." Brendan exhaled. He ran a hand through his hair, which was something he did when he was working up to saying something he'd already decided to say. He said, "You know how he is. He didn't mean anything by it. You could have just let it go." "I've been letting it go for 3 years, Brendan. And it's been fine." She looked at him. "It's been fine," she said. "I didn't mean. I know what you meant." He said something else after that. He said several things. She heard them and she noted them, and she continued composing her message to Preethi. After a while, he went back out to the deck. She heard the door slide open and closed. She stood at the kitchen counter. Outside the window, the last of the light was leaving the tree line. She could hear distantly her mother-in-law's voice, resuming the table's normal rhythm, moving on, as it always did, as it had always done. She thought about the apartment in Scarborough, the kitchen table, her mother coming home at 7 in the morning after a night shift and eating toast standing up because she didn't have the energy to sit. She thought about the version of herself that had married Brendan Calloway and had believed genuinely that love was sufficient, that you could love your way out of a family's contempt, that you could outlast it, that enough patience and enough dignity would eventually add up to something. She finished the message to Preethi. She pressed send. Then she put her phone on the counter and looked at her hands. She had built Sova systems alone. She had done it in an industry that had not expected her, in a country that had not always been sure what to do with her. And she had done it without anyone in the Calloway family ever asking her once. Not once in 3 years. What that had cost her. And she thought, enough. She was still in the kitchen when Patrick's wife Jennifer came in. Jennifer didn't say anything at first. She went to the sink and ran water and got a glass and filled it and drank some of it and then stood there. After a while, she said, "For what it's worth, I was going to say something." Zuri said, "I know, Patrick too. He just—" "I know," Zuri said again, and she did know, and she didn't hold it against them exactly, because she understood the particular paralysis of being inside a family system and feeling the weight of it pressing down on you every time you thought about opening your mouth. Jennifer said quietly, "You don't have to go back out there." Zuri picked up her phone. She said, "No, I don't." She went upstairs. She packed her bag carefully and efficiently, the way she did everything. She called a car because she'd had 2 glasses of wine and she didn't trust the highway after that. She came back downstairs with her bag. Brendan was in the living room. He saw the bag. He said, "You're not serious," she said. "I'll have Preeti send over the logistics for the week. I think we should. I think we probably need to talk about some things, but not tonight." "Zuri, you're overreacting." She looked at him standing there in the Calloway living room, in front of the Calloway fireplace, in the house where his family had been gathering for 30 years, and she thought about how much energy it had taken, every time she came here, to make herself smaller than she was. She said, "Good night, Brendan." She walked out the front door. She sat on the step in the July dark and waited for the car, and the crickets were very loud, and somewhere a screen door banged, and the warm air smelled like cut grass and lake water, and she sat with her hands in her lap and felt, not sad exactly, lighter. The way a person feels when they've finally put down something they'd been carrying, so long they'd stopped noticing the weight. The car was a black SUV, the kind the service always sent. The driver didn't talk, which she appreciated. She looked out the window at the highway lights, at the slow fade of suburban sprawl giving way to the city, and she thought about the week ahead. She had a board call on Tuesday. She had a meeting with their head of product on Wednesday about the new partnership pipeline they were building with 3 Atlantic credit unions. She had agreed, earlier in the month, to do a segment on BNN Bloomberg, a 7-minute conversation about fintech infrastructure and what she called the quiet risk in mid-tier banking systems. She had agreed to it reluctantly. She didn't enjoy that kind of thing, the performance of expertise, the way television required you to compress 12 years of work into a sequence of quotable sentences. But her communications director had made a reasonable case, and she had said yes. The segment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. They had said they might use it again on Wednesday morning if the news cycle cooperated. She didn't think much more about it that night. She did not hear from Brendan until Sunday afternoon. His message said, "I think we should talk." "Can I come by?" she replied. "Not today. Let's talk this week." He sent 2 more messages after that. She read them and did not respond. On Monday, she went to the office. Sova's offices were in a converted loft building near King and Spadina, exposed brick and very good espresso, the kind of space that had once housed a printing company and was now full of engineers arguing about API architecture. She liked being there. She liked the noise of it, the particular density of people who were solving real problems. She had a standing desk by the window that looked out over the street, and she stood at it for most of the afternoon while Preeti moved things around her calendar. And the Monday afternoon light came through at a low angle and made everything amber. She didn't think about the Calloway house, or she tried not to. She had gotten fairly good over the years at compartmentalizing. She went home at 7. She ate leftovers from a container. She went to sleep at 10:30. Tuesday morning, she was at the BNN Bloomberg studio on Bay Street by 7:15. The segment producer, a young woman named Faye who communicated exclusively in calm efficiency, walked her through the format. 7 to 10 minutes. Conversational. The anchor would lead with the news hook, and then open into the broader question about systemic risk. Zuri had done enough of these to know the rhythm. She wasn't nervous. She had stopped being nervous in front of cameras sometime around her third year of business, when she'd realized the camera was less frightening than a bank that didn't want to approve your credit line. The anchor was a woman she'd met once before at a conference. Professional, prepared, the kind of interviewer who actually read the material in advance. The interview went well. Zuri made the points she wanted to make. She used a phrase she'd been thinking about for a while. The infrastructure nobody talks about until it fails. The anchor seemed to like it. They ran a little over, which was usually a good sign. Faye said, afterward, that they'd likely run the clip again Wednesday morning. Zuri said, "Great," put her jacket back on and walked out into the Bay Street morning. She didn't know, at that moment, that the Calloway family was having breakfast. That Harriet had called a family meeting of sorts. Sunday had apparently not gone smoothly after she left, and there were things that needed to be resolved. Patrick and Jennifer had driven back to Oakville Monday evening. Colin had stayed. Brendan's father, Gordon, who was stayed quiet through a quiet man who had stayed quiet through 31 years of being married to Harriet Calloway, was sitting at the head of the table eating toast. She didn't know that the television in the Calloway kitchen, a large flat screen mounted under the cabinetry, tuned, as it always was in the mornings, to BNN Bloomberg, was on. She didn't know that Harriet was in the middle of saying something about expectations, about what was owed, about how a woman who wanted to be accepted into a family had a responsibility to. And then the segment came back. And our next guest has spent the past decade reshaping how Canada's mid-tier financial institutions think about their own digital infrastructure. She's the founder and CEO of the Systems, named to the Report on Business list of Canada's most innovative companies for the third consecutive year. Zuri Darko joining us now from our Toronto studio. The anchor said her name. The screen showed her face. Behind her name, the chyron read, Zuri Abinadarko, founder and CEO, Sova Systems, valued at $41 billion. The kitchen went quiet. Colin set his coffee mug down on the counter. He set it down with the careful precision of someone who needed something to do with their hands. Harriet stopped speaking. She did not resume. Brendan, who had been looking at his phone, looked up. He looked at the screen. He looked at his mother. He looked at his father, who was looking at the television with an expression that was hard to read. On screen, Zuri was speaking. She was talking about the concept of foundational risk, the idea that the least visible systems carry the greatest consequence when they fail. She was talking with the ease of someone who had been living inside this material for a decade, who had built the solutions she was describing, who was not performing competence, but simply demonstrating it, because it was what she had. The anchor said, "You've said publicly that one of the most persistent challenges in this space has been getting institutions to take the risk seriously. Before there's a crisis, what does that pattern look like from where you sit?" And Zuri, on the screen in the Calloway kitchen, said, "People are very good at dismissing things they don't fully understand. The assumption is usually that if something has been working a certain way, it's fine. But stability isn't the same as health. You can run a system on deferred maintenance for a long time before it gives out. And by the time it does, you've usually run out of options." She had not meant it about them, obviously. She had been talking about banking infrastructure. But the silence that followed in the Calloway kitchen had a different quality than the silences Zuri usually left behind in that house. The other silences had been comfortable. This one pressed down. Harriet sat very still. Gordon looked at his toast. Colin picked up his coffee mug again and put it down again. Brendan left the kitchen. They heard his footsteps on the stairs. Jennifer heard about it from Patrick, who had heard about it from Colin, who had texted him something that said only, "You should see Mum's face." Jennifer told Zuri about it on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks later, when she and Zuri met for a drink at a wine bar on Ossington. Zuri's suggestion, which had surprised her. They had not been in the habit of meeting separately. But things had shifted, she said. Harriet hasn't said anything about it to anyone, which is honestly very Harriet. Zuri said, "No, I imagine she hasn't." Jennifer turned her wine glass. Colin looked it up afterward, your whole company profile. He went very quiet. She paused. I think he'd assumed you worked in HR. Zuri looked at her. Then she laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that surprised her, and Jennifer laughed too. And for a moment they were just two women sitting at a bar in the West End, and the evening was warm, and the city moved past the window the way it always did. The papers, when they came, were handled with the same quiet efficiency that Zuri brought to everything else. Brendan did not contest them. He called her once, in September, and said, I'm sorry, I should have, and then stopped, and she waited, and he said, I should have said something, a long time ago. She said, yes. There was a pause. He said, is there anything? No, she said kindly. There isn't. She signed the documents on a Tuesday afternoon, in a boardroom at her lawyer's office on Bay Street, and afterward she walked out into the September light and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around her. A streetcar went past. Somewhere nearby someone was selling flowers from a stand, yellow and orange, the colors of the end of summer. She put her phone in her pocket. She thought about her mother getting off a night shift and eating toast standing up in the kitchen in Scarborough. She thought about the kitchen table, the homework, the particular discipline of a life where nothing came without work. She had built it alone, and it was hers, and it was real, and it would be there, in the morning. She started walking north. The city was loud and large and completely indifferent to her in the way she had always loved, the way that had always felt, to her, like freedom. She walked for a long time before she got in a cab, and she did not look back.